a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, joined by my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, also from La Sierra. For how many years now? I mean, you came in 1993, I think,
so it's been
as president.
22 years.
And you've been doing some archaeology as well, and so long history with archaeology. Biblical studies, Old Testament, similar in some ways, but more recent times. Dr. Kent Bramblett, who is Assistant Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra University. Interests in Hebrew Bible, ancient languages, archaeology. We've worked together for decades in the Middle East doing archaeology. We are in a long series. This is the long journey of going through the Bible, book by book, asking how it is that archaeology and the Bible relate. So we're asking basically questions about science and religion, about faith and science, about how it is that these interface, about the very good news that comes so many times when there's agreement. And I think it's also good news even when there's disagreement, because it makes us think about things some more. And now we are in the end of the book of Genesis. This is the 6th episode on the book of Genesis. And so we're looking this time at chapters 37, and we kind of skipped 38. That's a little bit of an interesting conundrum why that chapter is there in the order that the book of Genesis comes out. Genesis 37, the beginning of the Joseph story, his coat of many colors and so on. And then there's this interlude of chapter 38.
Well, it's related to Judah, right? And who also appears in the Joseph story. Judah's involved in the selling of Joseph down into Egypt, as I recall. And so they think about continuing on with what happened to Judah later, I guess, or something like that.
Well, I think that's correct. And then chapters 39 through 50 are continue the story about Joseph and going down to Egypt and so on. A number of people who've done literary studies, because we bring different disciplines to our study here. We're archaeologists, we bring archaeology. There are people who do literary studies. There are people who do anthropology, all kinds of things that are very helpful. But the people who study it from a literary point of view say that we might want to watch for echoes of chapter 38 in chapters following, like the role of a garment in both chapters. And so that has helped us think about the way these books are put together. I mean, there's nothing particularly inspired about putting one chapter before another or after another, but there are literary reasons that make sense. And God is overseeing this process, and people are putting it together. And we learn, I think, by listening to our friends who are studying in other directions.
The whole story of Joseph is like a short story, isn't it? I mean, it is definitely a unit. It's a literary piece and tells that story, and it's one of our favorites, isn't it?
It is, in lots of ways. Walk through, Larry, just the basic steps that what's happened here, because I want to come back and think about the nature of this story from a literary point of view. So walk through what happens.
As we know, Joseph, being one of the youngest, next to the youngest of his father's children, is his favorite, and he's given a coat of many colors. That's the traditional way to look at it. And his dad sends him off to find the other brothers who are with the flocks. And when he comes, they say, oh, here comes this brother who always gives us a problem, because there are stories that sort of set him up as the favorite, and they're jealous of him. And so they put him in a well, or a hole anyway, and along come the Amalekites, traders going down into Egypt, and so they arrange for a sale. And they're at Dothan at that time. And we know that one of the key roads that goes from Mesopotamia down into Egypt goes right by Dothan as they go through the pass that goes through the mountains there. And he's ends up in the employ of an important family in Egypt, ruler's family, and the wife of the ruler that they're living with tries to seduce him, and he flees, and he ends up in prison. And while he's in prison, he's able to interpret the story of a dream that one of his friends has, and they go off and are freed, and then one day they remember, oh yeah, that guy back in prison. And so Joseph gets his chance to come out of prison and to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And when it turns out to be correct, he's given a lot of honor, he's given a position in the country, and while he advises the Pharaoh as to how to handle the famine that comes, and in the process we learn that private land ends up as crown land, as money, as food is given out to people and so on. During this time, his brothers and his father back in Palestine come down into Egypt because the famine is so severe where they're living in Palestine that they're helped. And in the process of the negotiations and sale and so on, it's a long story, but Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and his father. They're amazed that he's still alive, that he's become this major person in Egypt. It's a wonderful story.
Right. So it ends in a family reunion.
That's right. That's
so
right.
You have this positive.
Yeah, and somebody who was sold as a slave ends up being the salvation of the whole family.
Right. Kent, in your study of Egyptian history, how often would somebody from outside be in a position of administration in the government?
It's pretty rare. There are the Egyptian stories where an Egyptian goes abroad, and because of this self-identity rises, Egyptians see themselves rising to the top. But yeah, for the reverse of that, it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
There was one period in Egyptian history where tradition has it that foreigners came in and took over the government.
Exactly.
Right? We call it the second intermediate or the Hyksos period.
Right.
So we are going to come back and talk about the Hyksos, which leads me to think about and to ask you some questions about what is in front of us here with these artifacts, because one of them is going to connect. Well, at least one of them is going to connect to the Hyksos, something you love to talk about, Kent. So I want you to tell us about the artifacts in front of you, and then we'll move over to the clay and alabaster.
Well, this is still the Middle Bronze Age. We mentioned that last time, about 2000 BC down to, say, 1600 or 1550. And surprisingly, the Middle Bronze Age is really the first time that bronze becomes a common metal. In the early Bronze Age, they're still mostly using copper. And so these weapons are nice bronze weapons made from, bronze is about 10% tin, made into an alloy with copper, and is much harder, much more durable. And these are a couple of swords. So they're handheld fighting devices, of course. This one would have had a long shaft hafted to it, so that would be a spear of some kind. And then this is an arrow point, and the arrow shaft would be hafted at the end of the point here. Stone weapons could still be used, or it could be ceremonial, but this one is a blade carved from stone.
An axe kind of thing?
Yeah,
that's what we're talking about.
And of course,
Here
battle axes.
Here in the West, we'd call it tomahawk, right?
Right, and battle axes were still used in that mode.
Right.
These two items are very special because they relate to the introduction of horses to this part of the world. The horse was domesticated in the steppes of Central Asia, where it was a native wild animal. But it was really with the invention of the stirrups and a way to control the horse that it then spread as a very useful creature, both for pulling the chariot and later somewhat for riding. But the Hyksos, which Larry mentioned, are these Canaanite peoples which migrated into the delta area of Egypt. The horse itself came through the Caucasus somehow from where it was domesticated. We know that the Hurrians, a people in the northern part of Mesopotamia, and the Hittites were the early adopters of this new technology. And their terminologies for horses stick with wherever the horse then is distributed. Clear down to Egypt, we still have the Hittite and Hurrian terminologies. There's even a training manual that talks about how to gentle train a horse. So this is a bit. So the metal shaft here would go in the horse's mouth, and the metal parts on each side would be
and almost some spikes on the sides.
Yeah, the different soft pieces would attach to those, and this was the equipment that made the horse a formidable military animal. It could be controlled. And about 1600 BC is when the horse first entered Canaan and Egypt.
Okay.
So it's really around the time of the story of Joseph.
And you mentioned the horseshoe.
Yeah, this is a horseshoe.
So we don't know the precise date. In fact, we don't know the context. That word context is so important to us with these particular artifacts. And so we want to use them for educational purposes. That's our goal with the artifacts we have. And so this has been very educational. Thank you for helping us with that. Now, what about artifacts over here? What do we have? Just a quick overview.
Well, again, it's mostly ceramic pottery, or pottery from the time of Joseph. Again, the middle vessel, the white one, is really from about 1600 BC. So it fits right in there. The others, also mostly from the Middle Bronze Age. And we have a couple of stone vessels, alabaster, which were typical of Egyptian tomb goods, as well as vessels for the wealthy.
Okay, very good. I wanted to come back to the Joseph story, and then we're going to look at some illustrative slides. This background is so helpful. It's important because the Hyksos give a context for a foreigner to rise to power. And people who have talked a lot about and studied a lot about the Exodus find that especially helpful. Otherwise, the history doesn't support the idea of foreigners coming in and doing it. The story itself, we talked a little bit about it. Thank you, Larry, for walking us through the story. People who study this literarily think about the kind of cycle. They use this language of cycles. You have Abraham and Sarah cycle, the Isaac and Rebecca cycle, the Jacob cycle. And then for a lot of people, there's also, even within the Jacob cycle, a sub-cycle for the Joseph stories. And a lot of people would say that when you read them carefully, and you know, that's what we do, when you read them carefully, there's even a kind of a different feel. Seems to be even a little bit of a different role for God as you read the stories carefully. And so probably what we have are these accounts pulled together all under this umbrella that we might call inspiration, as we've talked about in the past, pulled together maybe even from different places, but nevertheless pulled together. And now we have the narrative. And even if it has some of these dissimilarities, we read it now chronologically. But I think it's interesting to pay attention because the literary features are often indicators of a lesson. Or something we should pay attention to. And so by doing that, we're actually learning something too. Back to archaeology. So we have some slides to think about. And Kent, I want you to come over here and talk to us about the archaeology of the Nile Delta. Just talked about the Hyksos, you talked about the horses. This is where we go to find the Hyksos.
Well, I think first of all, just noticing the green. Of course, most of Egypt is desert sand, but the river-fed irrigation potential here with the Nile River is very important. And that's the reason why in the land of Canaan, or what becomes Israel, anytime there's a famine, which is, you know, maybe 3 years with subpar rain, the people start to suffer. Where do they go? They always migrate down into Egypt, where you have the steady waters of the Nile River. And so this is why Canaanites, or as the Egyptians called them Asiatics, because they're in Western Asia, migrated into the Delta. And it was always a concern for the native Egyptians. What if there are too many of them? And so the 15th dynasty, what we call the Hyksos period, is named after the Canaanites who actually did take control of Egypt. So this is this is downstream, so we call it Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is here.
We think north is up,
yeah,
we have to reverse that.
Right. And the eastern part of the delta is the land of Goshen. And we see cities here that we'll recognize in just a minute. But the 14th dynasty, I have to backtrack just a little bit. The 14th dynasty was a period of political weakness in Egypt. And with the 15th dynasty, there must have been some sort of political event where the Hyksos finally took power. In fact, as their name means foreign rulers. Roman historian Josephus thought that it meant shepherd kings, but it really means foreign rulers. And they ruled from this site right here, Avaris, known as Tel Daba in modern times. But Avaris is huge. It's like a square mile of built up palaces and places where people would live. And it's right there on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile River. So all these branches have names. Avaris was this great city until the Pelusiac branch dried up, shifting deltas. And so after that, the Tanitic branch was the nearest branch of the Nile in the east here. And so people moved actually some of the stone monuments with Ramses II's name inscribed on them to Tanis. And there was a lot of confusion in the early days of archaeology about really where the central stories of the Exodus, the forced labor of the Israelites, must have occurred. But it would be right in this area here.
Right. So that delta, any other archaeology that would be important or interesting to this story, to the Hyksos, to the Joseph story?
Certainly when Joseph comes to Egypt, we still have the Hyksos in power. We know that when a pharaoh rose who knew not Joseph, this would be probably after the Reconquista of the native Egyptians, who had maintained a very weak dynasty in Upper Egypt. And so they pushed then the Canaanites, or the Hyksos, out of Egypt and back into Palestine. We don't have it on the map here, do we? But some of the locations mentioned in the Exodus would be down this, coming down this direction, and they would occur somewhere around the Bitter Lakes area.
I've read some who would argue that the removal of the Hyksos, and that can be dated fairly well, that was a kind of an exodus. I mean, it was a forced exodus, but it was, people have used the language of exodus because it is a movement of a large group of people. In fact, we'll look at a text that describes that and
That's
talks about it.
That's a very interesting thing, actually. There's some indication in later Greek writings from the Phoenician regions that there was a sort of a residual memory among the Canaanites of having been forced out of Egypt, which would play very interesting ways with Israelite memories themselves.
Well, and when we get to the book of Exodus, we'll have to include this as part of our conversation. There are so many challenges that we face. Larry spent some time and gave a presentation at an Exodus conference, and so you'll be able to report all of the important news from there. But in any case, this is an important
I was going to
part.
mention where the star is. Memphis is one of the old capitals of Egypt, probably the most important one in Lower Egypt. If you follow the Nile down to the south to Upper Egypt, you come to Thebes and Karnak, which is probably the key capital during, the 18th dynasty, 19th dynasty. But there are those two capitals, and if the kings are relating to Palestine, they spend time in Memphis, but if they want to get off on their own in true Egyptian territory, they go down to the south. But isn't it interesting how the Nile going into the delta provides this beautiful feel for a lily, maybe a water lily, The delta is that water lily, and there's even a little lake there on the left, Fayum, that is a protrusion from the stem.
You're wanting this to be a leaf.
I want this to be a leaf, that's right. I think it's beautiful.
It is beautiful.
And was it Herodotus who talked about Egypt being the gift of the Nile, and so that green is there only because of the Nile.
And of course, in Egyptian theology, the deities behind that who supplied that fertility and rain and so on. A couple of images. This one of Asiatics, Semitic types of people moving about the time of the Hyksos. It found in a tomb, on a tomb wall.
And you notice the different dress. All of the people with lighter skin and bulkier hair and sandals on.
The men have beards.
Men have beards, and the clothes are maybe homespun and different from the Egyptians down in the right-hand corner, where they wear white linen and where they're darker skinned and they have coiffed hair and they're barefooted. There definitely is a difference, isn't it, between the Asiatics and the native Egyptians?
It's not quite a photograph, but it certainly reflects those very
and their
close
self-perceptions
details.
as well.
Right. Okay, we're archaeologists. We love pictures of archaeological excavations. This doesn't look really promising.
There's a lot of it.
But there is a lot.
This is Tel Daba. So this is where the capital of the Hyksos was, and actually where Ramses built his palace shortly after in the 19th dynasty. Notice there's no stone walls. This is mud brick. In the Delta, there was no access to stone, and so they built with mud brick. And of course, we know about that with the story of the Israelites being forced to make those mud bricks.
Right. So this fits so well that account, doesn't it?
It does.
And it's we're talking about right here in the eastern delta, the northeastern delta. Now, a couple of texts that we want to look at. One of them, the Annals of, how do I say it, Dedumoses? Is that what I do? Is it something like that? I don't know where to put the accent.
Dedumos or Dedumoses.
Okay, something like that. You're the Egyptian scholar, so I'm looking to you, Kent. on
That's
this.
the Greek version of it there.
Oh, okay, that's true. It's already been through another language to get there. This individual, according to the text, was Pharaoh at the arrival of the Hyksos, and the date given here is 1640. Of course, that's BC, that's translated for us. The Hyksos, mostly of Semitic origin, described as brutal rulers. We'll look at that in some text. And then Kahmos and Ahmose repelled the Hyksos over a century later. Now, there's been debate about this. Talk to us about that.
Really, the account here comes from the time of the Ptolemies, maybe the 2nd century BC, much later, when we have accounts of the chronologies really of the pharaohs. And there's a connection we're making to what Manetho called Titu Meus. And if this is the same person, we don't even know that. And then we have a couple of the Dedumos kings, 1st and 2nd. And we don't know if they're from the 13th dynasty or the 16th dynasty. So there are several issues. But at least it gives us an account of the types of stories that were being told about the Hyksos in later Egyptian history.
So there's some filtering that's going on through history, but maybe something that goes back to
Could well be.
You mentioned Manetho, and many people may not realize that he is the historian from the Ptolemaic period that gives us the various dynasties, right? He numbers the dynasties, and nowadays we know that he didn't do that perfectly. Some dynasties are contemporary and some are sequential, but we need Manetho and his history of the dynasties and of Egypt to give us the foundation for what we know.
So what we want to do is look at some of the text here. Kent, maybe you could read this part from those annals, again late, but the idea is to represent the 2nd millennium BC, whether they do it faithfully or not.
During the reign of Pharaoh Dedumos, the wrath of the divine assembly struck Egypt unexpectedly from the east. These Hyksos fanatics marched confidently to victory against our land. They ruthlessly burned our cities, razed the temples, treated the people of Egypt with hostility, massacred our soldiers, enslaved our women and children.
So they have this strong feeling against, at least represented in the 2nd century BC.
Right.
Larry.
Eventually, the native Egyptian rulers declared their independence of the Hyksos, and a long and hard-fought revolt quickly spread across the rest of Egypt. Finally, all the Hyksos were driven into a small area around Avaris. Having realized there was no hope, the Hyksos negotiated a treaty that guaranteed them safe conduct out of Egypt. 240,000 Hyksos left Egypt for Syria.
So fits into this story. We don't have time. It'd be interesting to talk about the numbers. But I want to get to the stories of Anubis and Bata, who were twins. There are some accounts that resemble other sibling stories in the Bible, but it's the attempted seduction of Joseph that there's a parallel to here in this story. So Kent, read this for us.
Then she, the wife of Anubis, said to Bata, "My, you are certainly strong. Every day I notice your bulging muscles." To convince Bata to have intercourse with her, the wife of Anubis jumped up and threw her arms around him. "Sleep with me just this once, and I will sew some new clothes for you." Bata became furious as a leopard at the very thought of sleeping with his brother's wife.
Does that sound like a Joseph account? I mean, you had related that earlier,
right.
Larry.
That's
and
right.
so you have this attempt at seduction. So what kind of response? We have the husband returning. Larry, would you read?
When Anubis returned, she, that is his wife, told him, "When your brother came back for some seed, I was here alone, and he propositioned me. 'Let your hair down and sleep with me just this once.' I would not pay any attention to him, but he panicked and beat me so that I would not tell you. Now, if you let him live, I will kill myself."
Again, similar sorts of things. Kent.
You can imagine Potiphar's wife saying just those things, can't you?
yes, Kent.
Anubis became furious as a leopard. He fetched his spear, he sharpened it, and stood behind the barn door to wait for Bata to return with the cattle later that evening. As soon as Bata looked under the door of the barn, he dropped the tools and ran. His brother chased him. Bata began to pray. The moment Ra heard his prayer, he created a lake full of crocodiles around Bata to protect him.
Yes, and that is sort of the end of the story, but there is there are a lot of similarities here. And how do we talk about, and we only have a few seconds to talk about it, but how do we talk about these similarities? What does that mean as we're reading the Bible and the biblical account?
It again shows that the biblical stories have a context in the ancient world. There's got to be some kind of a relationship, not necessarily a literary relationship, but both go back to this concept of what was happening.
And of sibling rivalry issues.
Right. And I'm wondering if biblical writers don't pick up what's common, but then put it into a new type of lesson, a new kind of important point.
And the deity is always so different in the Bible compared to all these factions.
Thank you, Larry and Kent, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.